So this is my TouchDesigner file. It's giving me a warning because the Kinect isn't plugged into the computer. So this is the Kinect. It takes all the channels from the Kinect, and then over here these select out the specific channels I want. So we got the X, which is the depth, and then the X and the Y axes. Over here these take the range of the maximum and minimum of where my hand is on the projection, and then scale it to the maximum and minimum of the TouchDesigner screen. And then it routes into these bases, which are the visuals, and then it sends them out through Spout using these things. So if we go into my fire scene, this is the coding. Again, we have the Z, the X, and the Y. So here, this Z goes to this count, so every time the Z passes a certain threshold, it'll add 1 to this, and that count is selected to a noise, so every time this changes, it spits out another randomized value, which gets sent to this switch, which, based on the input it receives, it'll display one of these 3 scenes and overlay it onto this background here. And this out just sends the data out of the base. So then, if we go into the firework, this uses a particle system. So we got the X and the Y controlling the center of the sphere, and the sort changes it from an ordered list of how it appears into a randomized one, so it doesn't look quite as uniform. And then we have, it takes a sphere and turns it into points, which is the particles, and then you can add forces to it. So you could add a positive force and the particles will fly up, or you can add a negative one and it'll act like there's gravity. So up here, this is again the Z, which this works in a similar way as before, where it counts up every time the hand passes a threshold, which then gets sent into these noise chops again, which randomize it, and then they get sent to the red, green, and blue, so that every time that it gets triggered, it's a different color, and this determines the color of the points in the geometry. And then over here, it's a trigger, so every time the hand passes a threshold, it'll trigger this math chop, which goes from 0 to 1000, which determines the particles that are birthed. So every time your hand crosses the trigger, it'll emit 1000 particles, which creates this fireworks effect. And then geometry and the camera and the light determine how the 3D objects are rendered out into a 2D. And that's how those works. And then if we go into flames, this is about the same thing but less complex. Again, a sphere controlled by the X, Y, and Z placement of the hand, and a simple particle system, again triggered by crossing a threshold. This time the particles have an upward force, which is why the flames fly upward, and then again rendering it out into a 2D image. And then flash, this one is slightly different. Again, it just uses a trigger, but instead of triggering the particle birth, it triggers the size of the sphere. So it goes from 0, which is not existing, to whatever size I have it set for. And then again, just rendering it out. And then all of these are different types of blurs, which just make it look more like a flash instead of a solid round ball. And then this is just combining them and adding them together into the out. So that's the fire scene. And then if we go back here into the stars, this works in a similar way, where I create a grid which then becomes the particle system, And I have a noise over here, which changes how the grid is shaped. You can kind of see it moving, just to make it look less uniform. And here, instead of changing the position of the circle like I had in the fire scenes, this is changing the position of a metaball, which kind of works like a magnet. And then there's the force, which determines how the particles close to the metaball function. And then again, just rendering it out. And then we have a bunch of effects to make it look more natural. And then this is the background. So it's taking a constant and applying a range to it, and then using that range, it's creating speeds, which is then routed into this 2D noise. And how it's explained in the tutorial I watched, it's going through the Z parameter of the noise, and he explained it like going through a slab of marble. And then this is just the color gradient, and then the noise and the color gradient are combined to make the background. And then it's being overlaid with the stars. And that's essentially how all the visuals are created.